The autumn wind of 1944 carried more than fallen leaves through the streets of Berchtal, a small German town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. It carried whispers, rumors, and the unmistakable scent of fear that had been building for months as the war drew closer to German soil. Greta Hoffman stood at her kitchen window, watching the last of the morning mist rise from the cobblestone streets. At 32, she had already buried her husband Klaus on the Eastern Front, and now she faced the approaching war alone with her 8-year-old daughter, Anna. The letter from her sister in Aachen still trembled in her hands. Its words burned into her memory. The Americans are different from what we were told, the ones with the eagle patches on their shoulders. They fight like demons and show no mercy. The sound of approaching footsteps on the street below made Greta step back from the window. Her neighbor, Frau Weber, hurried past with her head down, clutching a small suitcase. More families were leaving each day, heading deeper into Germany, away from the advancing Allied forces. But Greta had nowhere to go. This house, this town, was all she and Anna had left. "Mama, why does everyone look so scared?" Anna asked from the kitchen table, where she sat with her schoolbook spread before her. Schools had been closed for weeks, but Greta insisted on continuing her daughter's education. Normal routines helped keep the terror at bay. "People are just worried about the war, little one," Greta replied, forcing a smile as she turned from the window. "But we're strong, remember? Hoffmans don't run from trouble." Anna nodded solemnly, her blonde braids catching the pale morning light. She had grown up too fast in recent years, learning to recognize the sound of different aircraft engines and knowing which cellar offered the best protection during air raids. No child should have such knowledge, Greta thought, but the world had gone mad. A sharp knock at the door made both mother and daughter freeze. Greta's heart hammered as she approached the entrance, knowing that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news these days. She opened the door to find Herr Miller, the town's postal clerk, standing on her doorstep with his face pale and drawn. "Frau Hoffman," he said in a low voice, glancing nervously up and down the street. "The mayor wants all women to gather in the town square at noon. There's news from the Western Front." Greta felt her stomach drop. "What kind of news?" Muller shook his head. "Nothing good, I'm afraid. The Americans have broken through our lines near the Siegfried fortifications. They're moving fast, faster than anyone expected." He paused, lowering his voice even further. "They say it's the paratroopers, the ones who jumped into Normandy and Holland. They call themselves Screaming Eagles." The name sent a chill through Greta's bones. She had heard stories about American paratroopers, elite soldiers who dropped from the sky behind enemy lines and fought with a ferocity that had become legendary. Nazi propaganda had painted them as ruthless killers who showed no quarter to German civilians. But Greta wondered how much of that was truth and how much was fear-mongering. "How long do we have?" she asked quietly. "Days, maybe a week if we're lucky," Muller replied. "The mayor is organizing the town's defense, but—" He trailed off, and Greta understood his meaning. What defense could a small town offer against battle-hardened paratroopers? After Muller left, Greta sat Anna down at the kitchen table and explained the situation as gently as she could. Her daughter listened with the serious expression of someone far older than her years. "Will the Americans hurt us, Mama?" Anna asked. Greta considered lying, offering false comfort, but she had always been honest with her daughter. "I don't know, Anna. Some people say they will, but others say they're not as bad as we've been told. What I do know is that we'll face whatever comes together, and we'll be smart and careful." At noon, Greta joined the crowd of women, children, and elderly men gathering in the town square. Mayor Kaufmann stood on the steps of the town hall, his usually proud bearing diminished by the weight of responsibility. His son had died at Stalingrad, and his older brother had never returned from France. Like so many German towns, Berchtal had paid a heavy price for the war. "Citizens," the mayor began, his voice carrying across the square despite its tremor. "I won't lie to you about our situation. American forces have advanced much faster than our military anticipated. Intelligence reports indicate that the 101st Airborne Division is leading the advance in our sector." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. Everyone had heard stories about the 101st Airborne. The Screaming Eagles, who had earned their reputation through daring operations across occupied Europe. They were said to be America's elite, soldiers chosen for their courage and fighting ability. "What does that mean for us?" called out Frau Zimmermann, whose husband had been taken prisoner in Italy. Mayor Kaufmann's face was grave. "It means we must prepare for occupation. I've been in contact with other towns that have fallen to American forces. The reports are mixed. Some communities have been treated fairly. Others have faced harsh retribution for resistance activities." Greta listened as the mayor outlined plans for hiding valuables, protecting food stores, and organizing safe houses for any German soldiers who might need to escape through the town. But her mind kept returning to one question. What would happen to the women and children when the Americans arrived? That evening, as Greta tucked Anna into bed, her daughter asked the question that had been haunting both of them all day. "Mama, what are Screaming Eagles really like?" Greta sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed Anna's hair. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I promise you this. No matter what they're like, we'll stay together, and we'll survive. We're stronger than we think." But as Greta lay awake that night, listening to the distant rumble of artillery drawing ever closer, she wondered if she had just made a promise she couldn't keep. Over the following days, the town transformed into a nervous fortress. Women buried family heirlooms in their gardens and cellars. Shop owners hid their best goods behind false walls. Children were taught to stay close to home and never talk to strangers in uniform. The few remaining men, mostly those too old or injured to serve in the Wehrmacht, organized watches and patrol schedules that everyone knew would be useless against elite American forces. Greta found herself drawn into a circle of women who met each evening in the back room of the baker's shop. They shared information, rumors, and fears, while planning for various scenarios that might unfold when the Americans arrived. "My cousin in Düren says the Americans separated the men from the women when they took the town," reported Frau Steiner, a widow whose 3 sons had all died in the war. "They questioned everyone about Nazi Party membership and weapons caches." "What happened to those they found?" asked another woman. Frau Steiner's face darkened. "Some were taken away. Others were made to clean up bomb damage and bury the dead. But she said the American officers were fair mostly. They didn't allow looting or other things." The other things went unspoken, but were understood by all. Stories of what invading armies did to conquered populations had circulated throughout Germany, fed by both propaganda and genuine reports from the Eastern Front. Elena Richter, a teacher whose husband had been missing since the Battle of the Bulge, spoke up from the corner of the room. "I heard something different from my brother-in-law in Cologne. He said when the Americans came, they brought medical supplies and food for the civilians, said they had doctors who treated German wounded alongside their own." "Propaganda," scoffed Frau Weber, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Elena replied. "Or maybe the truth is more complicated than what either side tells us." Greta listened to these conversations with growing unease. The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing what to expect. At least with knowledge came the possibility of preparation. The unknown simply bred fear. On the 5th day after Mayor Kaufmann's announcement, the first refugees began arriving from towns closer to the front. They came in small groups, carrying what belongings they could manage, their faces etched with exhaustion and trauma. Their stories varied wildly, adding to the confusion and fear. An elderly farmer named Heinrich spoke of American tanks rolling through his village without firing a shot, their crews handing out chocolate to children. But a young mother from the next valley told of artillery bombardments that had leveled half her town before the Americans even arrived. "It depends on whether there's resistance," explained a man who had escaped from a village that had tried to fight. "The Americans give you one chance to surrender. If you fight, they hit back with everything they have. But if you don't resist," he shrugged, "they can be almost civilized." The word civilized stuck in Greta's mind. It seemed impossible to imagine anything civilized about war, yet perhaps there were degrees of barbarism. Perhaps survival meant understanding those degrees and acting accordingly. That night, as autumn rain drummed against her bedroom window, Greta made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She would not run. She would not hide. When the screaming eagles came to Berchtal, she would meet them with dignity and intelligence, protecting her daughter while trying to navigate whatever challenges they brought. She had no way of knowing that her decision would put her directly in the path of men who were about to change her understanding of war, enemy soldiers, and her own capacity for courage. The sound that woke the town on that gray October morning was unlike anything most residents had ever heard. It started as a low rumble like distant thunder, but it grew steadily louder and more complex. To the east, barely visible through the morning fog, dark shapes moved across the hills with mechanical precision. Greta stood at her window, Anna pressed against her side, watching as the rumble resolved into the unmistakable sound of tracked vehicles, tanks. Armored personnel carriers and trucks created a steel river flowing toward Berchtal. But it was the sight that froze her blood. Hundreds of soldiers moving alongside the vehicles, their weapons ready, their movements coordinated with the precision of a hunting pack. Even from a distance, she could see the distinctive patches on their shoulders, the eagle head that marked them as members of the 101st Airborne Division. The screaming eagles had arrived. "Mama," Anna whispered, "they look so scary." Greta pulled her daughter closer, watching as the American force deployed with military efficiency around the town's perimeter. These were not the war-weary, demoralized soldiers that German propaganda had promised would eventually reach German soil. These men moved with confidence, purpose, and the kind of professional competence that came only from victory after victory. A white flag appeared at the town hall, and Mayor Kaufman walked slowly toward the advancing Americans. Greta held her breath as she watched the small figure of their mayor approach what looked like an entire army. The negotiations, if they could be called that, lasted less than 10 minutes. When Mayor Kaufman walked back toward the town, his shoulders were slumped in defeat. The Americans had accepted the town's surrender, but Greta suspected the terms had not been open to discussion. Within an hour, American soldiers were patrolling the streets of Berchtal. They moved in pairs, their weapons at the ready, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. But what struck Greta most was their youth. Many looked barely older than boys, though they carried themselves with the confidence of seasoned warriors. The first soldiers to reach her street were led by a sergeant who couldn't have been more than 25. He had the lean build and alert eyes of someone who had survived months of combat, but when he saw Greta and Anna watching from their window, he touched the brim of his helmet in a gesture that was almost polite. "Interesting," Greta murmured to herself. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had been told to expect, that it left her momentarily confused. The real test, she knew, would come when the Americans began their house-to-house searches. Every German civilian had been warned to expect interrogations, confiscations, and worse. But as Greta watched the soldiers methodically work their way down the street, she noticed something else unexpected. They were knocking on doors, actually knocking and waiting for responses rather than simply kicking them in. When the knock came at her own door, Greta took a deep breath, squeezed Anna's hand, and went to meet her fate. Whatever the screaming eagles brought to her town, she would face it with her head held high. She had no idea that the young sergeant standing on her doorstep was about to challenge every assumption she had made about American soldiers, about enemies, and about the nature of war itself. The young sergeant standing at Greta's door was not what she had expected. He was tall and lean, with dark hair visible beneath his helmet and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His uniform was dusty and worn from weeks of combat, but his equipment was meticulously maintained. The eagle patch on his shoulder bore the words 101st Airborne in letters that seemed to command respect. "Ma'am," he said in heavily accented German, removing his helmet and holding it under his arm. "I'm Sergeant Michael O'Brien, United States Army. We need to search your house as part of our security sweep. May we come in?" The politeness of his request caught Greta completely off guard. She had expected demands, not requests. She had expected to be pushed aside while soldiers ransacked her home, not asked for permission to enter. She stammered, then found her voice. "Yes, of course. Please come in." Sergeant O'Brien entered, followed by a younger soldier who looked barely 18. This second soldier had sandy hair and nervous eyes that darted around the room constantly. His name tag read Thompson, and unlike his sergeant, he seemed uncomfortable with the situation. "This is Private Thompson," O'Brien explained, switching to English but speaking slowly so Greta could follow. "We're looking for weapons, military equipment, or German soldiers who might be hiding. If you cooperate, this will be quick and we'll be out of your way." Anna clung to her mother's skirt, staring up at the American soldiers with wide eyes. Thompson noticed her and smiled awkwardly, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small piece of chocolate wrapped in brown paper. "For the little girl," he said in broken German, offering the candy to Anna. Greta hesitated. Accepting gifts from occupying soldiers felt wrong somehow, but Anna's eyes had lit up at the sight of real chocolate, something she hadn't tasted in over a year. Before Greta could decide, Anna had taken the chocolate and was already unwrapping it. "Thank you," Greta said quietly to Thompson, who smiled and nodded. "My sister back home is about her age," he explained. "Kids shouldn't have to go through wars." While Thompson engaged Anna in halting conversation, mixing English and German words, Sergeant O'Brien conducted his search. He was thorough but respectful, checking closets and under furniture without destroying anything. When he examined Klaus's old desk, he found the photograph of Greta's husband in his Wehrmacht uniform. O'Brien studied the photograph for a long moment, and Greta tensed, waiting for accusations or anger. Instead, the sergeant simply placed it back where he had found it. "Your husband?" he asked gently. "Yes," Greta replied. "He died at Stalingrad." O'Brien nodded slowly. "I'm sorry for your loss. War is hard on everyone." The simple humanity of his response brought unexpected tears to Greta's eyes. She had prepared herself for hatred, for blame, for retribution. She had not prepared herself for sympathy from an enemy soldier. "You have no other men living here?" O'Brien continued, returning to his duties. "No soldiers staying here or hiding?" "No," Greta answered honestly. "Just Anna and myself." The search continued through the house, but O'Brien's respectful manner had transformed what Greta expected to be a violation into something more like an awkward social visit. When they finished, O'Brien gathered his equipment and prepared to leave. "Ma'am," he said formally, "you should know that a curfew is in effect. No one is allowed on the streets after sunset without special permission. Food distribution will be organized through the town hall. If you have any problems with soldiers bothering you or your daughter, you report it immediately to the military police. Is that understood?" Greta nodded, struck again by the organized, civilized nature of the occupation. This was not the chaos and brutality she had been led to expect. One more thing, O'Brien added, his voice becoming less formal. Some of my men haven't seen home in over a year. They've been through a lot of fighting. Most are good soldiers who follow orders, but, well, it's best to be careful. Keep your doors locked and don't go out alone at night. It was a warning, but it was also protection. Greta realized that this sergeant was trying to keep her and Anna safe, not threatening them. After the Americans left, Greta sat at her kitchen table trying to process what had just happened. Everything she had been told about American soldiers, everything the propaganda had promised about their brutality and hatred of Germans, had been contradicted by 20 minutes in her own home. Anna, meanwhile, was savoring her chocolate with the kind of intense concentration that only children could manage. "Mama," she said between small bites, "the young soldier said he has a sister like me. Do you think she's scared too?" Greta looked at her daughter, struck by the simplicity of the observation. Children saw what adults often missed, that soldiers were people too, with families and fears and reasons to want to survive the war. "I imagine she is, sweetheart," Greta replied. "I imagine everyone is scared during a war." Over the following days, Birchtal settled into an uneasy routine under American occupation. The 101st Airborne had established their command post in the school building, while companies of soldiers were billeted throughout the town. The Americans had brought their own supplies, so there was no immediate competition for food, but they also enforced strict rules about movement and gatherings. Greta found herself watching the soldiers with growing fascination. They were so young, most of them, yet they carried themselves with the confidence of veterans. She learned to distinguish between the different ranks and roles, the officers who studied maps and coordinated operations, the sergeants who led patrols and maintained discipline, and the ordinary soldiers who cleaned weapons, stood guard duty, and wrote letters home. It was one of these ordinary soldiers who changed everything for Greta and Anna. His name was Corporal James Miller, and he had been assigned to patrol their section of town. Unlike some of the other soldiers, who maintained professional distance from the German civilians, Miller seemed genuinely curious about the people he was occupying. He spoke decent German, which he had learned from his grandmother, and he had a gentle manner that put even nervous civilians at ease. Miller first approached Greta when he noticed her attempting to repair the garden fence that had been damaged during the initial American advance. A tank had clipped the corner post while maneuvering around their street, leaving the fence sagging and unstable. "Excuse me, ma'am," Miller said, setting down his rifle and approaching the fence. "I'm handy with tools. Would you like some help with that?" Greta was so surprised by the offer that she almost dropped her hammer. You want to help?" "My fault it got broken in the first place," Miller replied with a grin. "Our driver isn't the most careful with corners. Besides, I used to help my dad build things back in Ohio. It's good to work with my hands again." Before Greta could fully process what was happening, the American soldier had rolled up his sleeves and begun examining the damaged fence with the practiced eye of someone who understood construction. Within an hour, working together with tools borrowed from Greta's late husband's workshop, they had the fence stronger than it had been before the war. "There," Miller said, stepping back to admire their work. "That should last another 20 years. Anna, who had been watching the entire process with fascination, finally found the courage to approach the friendly soldier. "Why are you helping us?" she asked in the direct way that only children could manage. Miller knelt down to Anna's eye level, his expression serious. "Because your mama seems like a nice lady who's been through a lot. And because my little sister back home would want someone to help her mama if she needed it." "What's your sister's name?" Anna asked. "Sarah," Miller replied, pulling a worn photograph from his wallet. "She's 7 years old, just about your age. She likes to read books and collect butterflies." Anna studied the photograph with intense concentration. She looks nice. Does she miss you? Miller's voice became softer. I hope so. I miss her a lot. Greta watched this exchange with a growing sense of unreality. Here was an enemy soldier, one of the feared Screaming Eagles, kneeling in her garden and sharing photographs of his family with her daughter. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming. That evening, as Greta prepared dinner in her small kitchen, she heard singing coming from the American camp. The voices were young and strong, harmonizing on a song she didn't recognize, but that sounded like a hymn. The melody was beautiful and melancholy, full of longing for something far away. Anna pressed her face against the kitchen window, listening intently. They sound sad, Mama. I think they are sad, sweetheart, Greta replied. They're far from home, just like we would be if we had to leave here. The singing continued long into the evening, and Greta found herself drawn to the window repeatedly, listening to these young men who had traveled thousands of miles to fight a war that had brought them to her small German town. Some of the voices were clearly very young, probably teenagers who had lied about their age to enlist. Others were deeper, older, carrying the weight of experience and loss. When the singing finally stopped, replaced by the quiet murmur of men talking around campfires, Greta realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of the war. These soldiers were not the monsters she had been told to expect. They were boys and men, far from home, doing a job that few of them probably wanted to do. The next morning brought new challenges and new revelations. Captain Robert Hayes, the company commander, had established office hours at the town hall to address civilian concerns and complaints. Greta decided to attend, partly out of curiosity and partly because she wanted to understand the American perspective on the occupation. Captain Hayes was older than most of his soldiers, probably in his early 30s, with graying hair at his temples and the kind of steady demeanor that inspired confidence. He spoke fluent German and seemed genuinely committed to making the occupation as bearable as possible for the civilian population. Our goal, he explained to the small group of German civilians who had gathered to hear him speak, is to maintain order and security while we continue military operations. We're not here to punish the civilian population. We're here to defeat the German military and end this war as quickly as possible. Frau Weber, who had been one of the most vocal critics of American occupation, raised her hand. What about food? Winter is coming and our supplies are limited. We've brought our own food supplies, Captain Hayes replied. We won't take food from German civilians. In fact, we have medical supplies and some food that we can share if the situation becomes desperate. This was so contrary to what everyone had expected that several people exchanged skeptical glances. What's the catch? Asked Herr Fischer, the town's blacksmith. Captain Hayes smiled grimly. The catch is that we need information about German military units in the area. We need to know about supply caches, communication networks, and any soldiers who might be planning partisan activities. We're not asking you to betray your own people, but we need to maintain security. Greta listened to this exchange with growing understanding. The Americans were trying to balance military necessity with humanitarian concerns. They wanted to win the war, but they also wanted to minimize civilian casualties and suffering. It was a more complex approach than she had expected from an occupying army. After the meeting, as Greta walked home through streets now patrolled by American soldiers, she reflected on how much her world had changed in just a few days. The Screaming Eagles had arrived with a fearsome reputation, but their actual behavior was far more nuanced than anyone had anticipated. That afternoon, while Anna played quietly in the garden, Greta heard a commotion from the street. Looking out her window, she saw a crowd gathering around two American soldiers who were helping an elderly German woman carry heavy bags of supplies from the makeshift distribution center that had been set up near the town square. The woman was Frau Kellner, a widow in her 70s whose arthritis made walking difficult on the best of days. The two soldiers, both young privates, had noticed her struggling and simply stepped in to help. They carried her bags all the way to her house, 3 blocks away, without being asked and without expecting any reward. Greta watched this small act of kindness with a mixture of confusion and growing hope. If these soldiers could show compassion to a German widow, perhaps the occupation would be more bearable than anyone had dared to imagine. But she also knew that not all of the Americans would be as disciplined or compassionate as the ones she had encountered. And she knew that the real test would come when the soldiers grew bored, homesick, or frustrated with the pace of the war. As evening approached and the American soldiers began their nightly routine of perimeter checks and guard rotations, Greta made a decision that would define her relationship with the occupying forces. She would judge these men by their individual actions, not by their nationality or the circumstances that had brought them to her town. It was a radical departure from everything she had been taught to believe about enemies and war. But as she watched Corporal Miller share his evening rations with a hungry German child whose mother was too proud to ask for help, Greta realized that perhaps the most important lesson of war was learning to see the humanity in those who were supposed to be your enemies. The night passed quietly, marked only by the soft footsteps of American sentries and the distant sound of radio communications from the command post. For the first time since the soldiers had arrived, Greta felt something that had been absent from her life for months, a cautious sense of security. She had no way of knowing that her evolving relationship with the Screaming Eagles would soon be tested by events that would force both sides to choose between military duty and human decency. The crisis that would test every relationship built between the German civilians and American soldiers came on a cold November morning, 3 weeks into the occupation. Greta was hanging laundry in her backyard when she heard the sharp crack of rifle fire from the eastern edge of town, followed immediately by shouted commands in both German and English. Anna, who had been playing with a wooden doll that Corporal Miller had carved for her, immediately ran to her mother's side. After weeks of relative peace, the sound of gunfire sent a chill of fear through both civilians and soldiers alike. "Stay close to me," Greta told her daughter, pulling Anna into the house as more shots echoed across the town. Through her kitchen window, she could see American soldiers running toward the sound of the fighting, their weapons ready and their movements coordinated with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, Sergeant O'Brien appeared at her door, his face grim and urgent. "Ma'am, we need you and your daughter to stay inside with the doors locked," he said quickly. "German soldiers have attacked our eastern checkpoint. We don't know how many there are or what their intentions might be." "German soldiers?" Greta asked, confused. "But the town surrendered weeks ago." "These aren't local defenders," O'Brien explained. "Intelligence suggests they're SS troops retreating from the front lines. They're not following the same rules as regular Wehrmacht units." The distinction was important and terrifying. Regular German army soldiers might respect civilian immunity and surrender protocols, but SS troops were fanatics who had been trained to fight to the death and show no mercy to anyone they considered enemies of the Reich. As O'Brien hurried away to rejoin his unit, Greta bolted her door and pulled Anna away from the windows. The sound of gunfire was growing more intense, punctuated by the distinctive whine of bullets ricocheting off stone buildings. "Mama, what's happening?" Anna asked, her voice small and frightened. Before Greta could answer, the fighting moved closer to the center of town. Through her front window, she could see American soldiers taking cover behind garden walls and corners of buildings, returning fire toward an enemy she couldn't see. The professional calm that had characterized the occupation was replaced by the deadly intensity of combat. Then she saw something that made her blood freeze. 3 German soldiers in SS uniforms were moving through the back gardens of the houses across the street, clearly trying to flank the American positions. One of them was carrying a Panzerfaust, a handheld anti-tank weapon that could destroy entire buildings if used against civilian structures. Greta faced an impossible choice. She could remain hidden and safe, protecting herself and Anna from the crossfire. Or she could warn the Americans about the flanking movement, potentially saving their lives but also marking herself as a collaborator in the eyes of her own countrymen. The decision was made for her when she saw where the SS soldiers were heading, toward the house where elderly Frau Kellner lived alone. The same woman who had been helped by American soldiers just days earlier was directly in the path of men who would show no regard for her safety. "Anna, go to the cellar and stay there no matter what happens," Greta ordered, pushing her daughter toward the stairs that led to their small basement. "Don't come up until I tell you it's safe." "Mama, where are you going?" Anna cried. "To do what's right," Greta replied, grabbing her late husband's hunting jacket and heading for the back door. Greta's garden shared a fence with the alley that ran behind the main street. If she could reach the American soldiers without being seen by the SS troops, she might be able to warn them about the flanking attack. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but the thought of Frau Kellner being caught in crossfire drove her forward. She slipped out her back door and crept along the fence until she could see Corporal Miller and 2 other soldiers taking cover behind an overturned cart about 50 meters away. Between her and the Americans, she could see the SS troops moving carefully through the shadows, completely unaware that they were being observed. Taking a deep breath, Greta cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted in English, "Miller, 3 soldiers with rockets behind the gardens. They're moving toward Kellner's house." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Miller spun toward her voice, spotted the German soldiers she was indicating, and immediately began directing his men to counter the flanking movement. The SS troops, realizing they had been discovered, opened fire in all directions, trying to complete their attack before the Americans could respond. What followed was the most terrifying 10 minutes of Greta's life. Bullets flew over her head as she pressed herself against the ground, while American and German soldiers engaged in close-quarters combat just meters away. She heard the distinctive crack of American rifles, the sharper report of German weapons, and the shouted commands of men fighting for their lives. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was almost as frightening as the battle had been. Greta raised her head cautiously and saw Corporal Miller approaching her position, his rifle still ready but his expression relieved. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "I'm fine," Greta replied, though she was shaking from adrenaline and fear. "What about the SS soldiers?" "2 dead, 1 captured," Miller reported grimly. "They were carrying enough explosives to level half the block. If they had reached their target—" He trailed off, but Greta understood. The flanking attack could have killed dozens of civilians and soldiers alike. "Why did you warn us?" Miller asked quietly. "Those were your own countrymen." Greta looked toward Frau Kellner's house, where she could see the elderly woman peering out fearfully from behind her curtains. "No," she said firmly. "My countrymen are the people of this town. Those soldiers would have killed anyone in their way, German or American." The aftermath of the skirmish marked a turning point in the relationship between the 101st Airborne and the civilians of Berchtal. Word of Greta's warning spread quickly through both communities, creating a new level of trust and cooperation that had been absent during the first weeks of occupation. Captain Hayes personally thanked Greta for her actions, and when several other German civilians came forward with information about hidden weapon caches and possible partisan hideouts, it became clear that the town was choosing cooperation over resistance. But the most significant change was in how the American soldiers viewed their civilian neighbors. No longer were the Germans simply potential threats to be monitored and controlled. They had become, in many cases, allies in maintaining peace and security. This shift was most visible in the relationship between the soldiers and the town's children. What had begun as cautious exchanges of chocolate and small gifts evolved into something approaching friendship. American soldiers taught German children American songs and games, while the children helped the soldiers practice their German and understand local customs. Anna became something of a bridge between the two communities. Her innocent friendship with Corporal Miller and several other soldiers helped break down barriers that might have persisted for months. She translated conversations, delivered messages, and gradually helped both sides see each other as individuals rather than enemies. Miller, in particular, seemed to find comfort in his relationship with Anna and Greta. Far from home and family, he had discovered a surrogate family in the German widow and her daughter. He helped with household repairs, shared his rations when food was scarce, and told Anna stories about America that fired her imagination. "Is it really true that American children go to school for free?" Anna asked one evening as Miller helped her with an arithmetic lesson. "Absolutely true," Miller replied, smiling at her wonder. "And when the war is over, maybe you can visit America and see for yourself." "Could Mama come too?" Anna asked. Miller glanced at Greta, who was mending clothes nearby. "I think your mama would love America. We have lots of farms and small towns just like this one." These casual conversations about the future represented a profound shift in thinking. Instead of viewing the occupation as a temporary military necessity, both sides were beginning to imagine a post-war world where former enemies might become friends, even family. The change wasn't universal, of course. Some German civilians remained resentful of the occupation, and some American soldiers maintained their professional distance. But for many, the daily interactions of shared humanity had overcome the artificial divisions of nationality and war. As winter deepened, the practical cooperation between civilians and soldiers became even more important. When a severe snowstorm damaged several roofs in the town, American soldiers worked alongside German civilians to make repairs. When an outbreak of flu threatened the American camp, German women who had nursing experience volunteered to help care for the sick soldiers. Greta found herself serving as an unofficial liaison between the two communities. Her warning about the SS attack had earned her the trust of the American commanders, while her consistent protection of civilian interests had maintained her standing with the German townspeople. "You've become quite the diplomat," Captain Hayes observed one day as Greta helped resolve a dispute about food distribution. "Have you ever considered a career in international relations?" Greta laughed at the suggestion. "I'm just a widow trying to take care of her daughter and her neighbors, but I've learned that most problems can be solved when people talk to each other honestly." This simple wisdom had guided her actions throughout the occupation. By refusing to see the American soldiers as monsters or heroes, by treating them as individuals with their own fears and hopes, she had helped create something that neither side had expected: a genuine community that transcended the divisions of war. The most dramatic example of this transformation came in December, when word arrived that American forces were pulling back to regroup for a major offensive. The 101st Airborne would be leaving Berchtesgaden within days, moving to what would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The announcement created an unexpected wave of emotion in the town. Children cried at the thought of losing their American friends. Women who had come to rely on the soldiers' help with heavy labor wondered how they would manage. Even men who had initially resented the occupation admitted they had come to respect the Americans' professionalism and restraint. On the final evening before the 101st Airborne departed, the soldiers and civilians gathered in the town square for an impromptu farewell celebration. It was a surreal scene. American soldiers and German civilians sharing food, music, and conversation as if they were old friends rather than former enemies. Corporal Miller approached Greta and Anna with a carefully wrapped package. "This is for Anna," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to have something too." Inside the package was a beautiful wooden jewelry box that Miller had carved during his spare time, along with a photograph of himself with Anna and Greta. On the back of the photograph, he had written, "To my German family, with love and hope for the future." Anna burst into tears, clinging to Miller as if she could prevent his departure through sheer will. "I don't want you to go," she sobbed. "You're like my papa now." Miller knelt down and hugged her tightly. "I have to go, sweetheart. But I promise you this. When this war is over, I'm coming back to visit. And maybe someday, you and your mama can come visit me in Ohio." "Do you promise?" Anna asked. "I promise," Miller replied solemnly. As the American soldiers prepared to leave the next morning, they were seen off not by hostile civilians eager for their departure, but by friends who genuinely regretted their leaving. Children waved small American flags that had been improvised from scraps of cloth. Women packed food for the soldiers' journey. Men shook hands and exchanged addresses, planning to maintain correspondence after the war. Greta stood at her garden gate, watching the convoy of vehicles disappear into the morning mist. Anna held her hand tightly, tears streaming down her face as she waved goodbye to the soldiers who had become such an important part of her young life. "Will we really see them again, Mama?" Anna asked. Greta looked down at her daughter, thinking about everything that had changed since that terrifying morning when the screaming eagles had first appeared on the horizon. She thought about fear transformed into friendship, enemies who had become family, and the unexpected ways that human connection could transcend the artificial boundaries of war. "I believe we will, sweetheart," she said, waving as the last vehicle disappeared from view. Good people find their way back to each other, no matter how far apart the world pulls them. Years later, when historians would write about the occupation of small German towns during World War II, they would focus on military strategy, political objectives, and statistical outcomes. They would largely miss the human story of how a group of young American soldiers and a community of German civilians discovered that their shared humanity was stronger than the hatred that had brought them together. But in the memory of a small girl who grew up to become a bridge between two cultures, and in the heart of a German widow who learned that enemies could become family, that human story lived on. It lived on in the letters that crossed the Atlantic for decades, in the reunion visits that followed the war, and in the simple truth that courage and compassion could flourish even in the midst of humanity's darkest hours. The Screaming Eagles had come to Berchtal as conquerors, but they left as friends. In a war defined by hatred and division, they had created something rare and precious, proof that understanding and respect could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, transforming both the conquered and the conquerors in ways that would last long after the last shots of the war had been fired.